So it probably comes as no surprise that one of my favorite shows in recent years was Mythbusters. I very much enjoy the way that they try to find out what the truth is behind tall tales and idioms and all sorts of things. Adam and Jamie are the hosts. They eventually had a second crew as well. They take on these movie things, right? Is this thing that happened in a movie, is that actually possible or is it impossible? And what they say is, we don't just tell you the myths, we put them to the test. And that's what made me think of them this morning. Because you could say to yourself, don't we already really know that this movie stuff is fake? Don't we already really know that this tall tale is indeed impossible? Well, not necessarily. On a number of occasions, the results that they found were very unexpected. One of the most interesting examples was the fact that you really can make a lead balloon. And that's what they came up with there. Now, they had to get the thinnest lead sheets imaginable. They had to get them from a company in Germany. They're thinner than like as thin as your hair, so that it wouldn't weigh that much. And then they had to carefully lay it out. It was a whole amazing thing. They proved that elephants really are afraid of mice. That if a mice runs in front of an elephant, it freaks it out. They proved, and they did a lot of stuff with guns and explosives because it's TV. They proved that if you're on the run from the bad guys, if you dive underwater, if you're as far as little as about a foot underwater, you're basically impervious to gunfire because the bullets break up when they hit the surface tension of the water. A lot of stuff like that you would think wasn't real, but it's true. Well, that's television and that's entertainment. Why would God need to put anything to the test? It's a legitimate question. God exists outside of time. God knows everything, including the thoughts and intentions of each human heart. Well, just as the show Mythbusters tried to prove, there is value in going from knowing something to proving something. So let's take a look at Genesis 22, verses 1 to 19 this morning. A very familiar passage. We'll start here. It says, sometime later, God tested Abraham. This is one of the most famous stories in the Bible. So it's not likely that you'll learn anything new about what happened in this, because you already know. Instead, then, let us focus on the much more important questions of why. Why God and why Abraham do what they do here. Our first indicator is the narrator's explanation that what we're about to witness is a test of Abraham by God. Now, we need to be very specific here. This was a test, not a temptation. Sometimes we use those words interchangeably. God doesn't do temptations, and he never will. What is being tested is the quality of Abraham's character. As our reading in Hebrews 11 reminded us, the particular quality being put to the test is Abraham's faith. Now, the question is it strong enough? Is it deep enough to overcome even a severe test? Now, we already know the answer, because Abraham is known as the man of faith. But even after waiting decades for Isaac to be born, that was waiting in faith, this moment will require more from Abraham. It will require a whole new level of faith. It's one thing to wait on a promise of something that is not, that might be. It's quite another thing to be tested about losing something that already is, about change, dramatic, tragic change. That's a whole different kind of faith. Fortunately for Abraham, his faith is in the enduring God, in the one who is everlasting. The Hebrew grammar here indicates that when it says sometime later God, it is that same God as in the last verse where Abraham called him the enduring God or the everlasting God. So the God who endures is the one who tests Abraham to see if his faith can endure, can hold. Well, here's the test. It says, he said to him, "Abraham, here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." So after his treaty with Abimelech, last week's text, Abraham's life went back to normal. We don't know how long it was until God spoke to him. So at this point, Isaac is somewhere between a child and perhaps a teenager, somewhere in there. From Abraham and Sarah's point of view, God's promise is right on track. Isaac is the embodiment of God's trustworthiness. He is God's promise fulfilled in the flesh, and he's growing toward adulthood. Everything is good. That God's test of Abraham is about Isaac means that everything Abraham and Sarah have been through up in this point can be used by Abraham. He can bolster his faith in God by saying he was trustworthy, and Isaac, the miracle child, was born. But at the same time, because it is Isaac, that very foundation of his faith is what is being tested. With the benefit of hindsight and knowing the nature of God as we do, this command from God to Abraham to sacrifice his only son Isaac doesn't seem to us to be fully real. We know too much about God. We know too much to truly understand what Abraham went through. Because in the ancient Near East, it was not uncommon for religious practices to involve child sacrifice. They believed that the gods were credited with the power over fertility. It was up to the gods whether your herds increased, whether your harvest was good, and yes, whether your family grew through children. They credited the various gods with that power. Therefore, they believed what they gave, they could also take away. Even children could be demanded back in sacrifice by the gods. That's a famous turning point in the plot of Homer's Iliad, with Agamemnon sacrificing Iphigenia. I didn't write that down. I thought of those names in the moment. I'm proud of myself. It's been some time since I was teaching English. God was responsible for Sarah's miraculous pregnancy. Abraham may think, this God whom I have had a relationship with for now decades would not be so cruel as to take Isaac away after making us wait so long and then finally giving us this, right? But he can't know that. He might feel that, he might think that, but he can't know it. The gods of the ancient Near East, they care about themselves. They don't care about the people who worship them, because the people who worship them in fear. So as the story unfolds, we have no reason to believe that Abraham did anything other than take God's command at face value. Now we, looking at this from our point of view, can see Christological parallels in this story, and we'll talk about those. Abraham had no such symbolism to help him. Moses, when writing this account, tells us nothing about what Abraham thought when God spoke to him. Unlike previously, when God said, "I'm going to judge Sodom and destroy it," there's no lengthy conversation between God and Abraham to sort out the details. No opportunity for Abraham to ask questions about why this is being asked of him. He certainly didn't think that it was a judgment against Isaac. Isaac's not being punished. This isn't the wrath of God. It must be something else. Long story short, we would do Abraham a disservice if we see this as anything less than a parent learning that his or her child, his or her only child, has days left to live. I can't imagine that reality. I don't want to imagine what that would be like. It's the worst nightmare of parents since time began, one that all too many have endured, some more than once. The difference between those cases where it's disease or an accident or the evil that other people do that takes a child away from their parent, this time it is God Himself who is choosing this path. Before we go on, let's pause for a moment. From our point of view, this test seems cruel and unnecessary. We think God could have accomplished more or less the same thing some other way, right? If you're going to test Abraham's faith, make it about something other than Isaac. That line of thinking makes sense to us. But humanity was in a much darker place in Abraham's day. Remember that there were very few people who knew God. His nature, His will were a mystery. It would take many generations for Him to reveal Himself fully through His people so that they would truly understand Him. And lastly, let us not forget that it is the very brutal death on a cross of God Himself that informs us so profoundly about who God really is. And Abraham doesn't have the benefit of that. So he is given this horrific task. What happens next? We see verse 3, early the next morning. Abraham did not hesitate. He began to obey God at the first opportunity to do so. Now, he couldn't fully obey God today because part of the command involved a journey to a distant mountain. They needed to walk there. But what Abraham could take care of today, he began to do early in the morning. No procrastination, no hesitation. The text doesn't tell us, but I wonder, did he tell Sarah about God's command? My guess is no. As a husband, I don't think he could have endured the emotion of telling her what was going to happen. I think he kept it from her, and he knew it would break her, and he'd rather make that wait a few days. We don't know the answer. But I can picture him spending that night, lying awake, staring up at the ceiling, asking, what's going on? What is this? Have I misjudged God? What's happening? What a hard night he must have endured before leaving the next morning. Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. Moses paints his actions as very deliberate. One step at a time. Do this, do this, do this. One task at a time toward his obedience. Abraham taking those necessary steps to prepare. Imagine knowing that your child will die in 3 days. Now you have hope about what will happen beyond the grave. And we've already heard that from the book of Hebrews. But the horror of this precious child's death is coming. Yet this morning, you get up, you get dressed, you eat breakfast, you pack your kids' lunch, you put them on the bus, and say, see you after school, like it's an ordinary day. It would take an extraordinary effort to simply put one foot in front of the other, and yet Abraham is moving forward. Whatever his thoughts and emotions are, we can imagine some of them. He keeps moving forward. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. Now, the journey may have been a distraction. You could almost forget why you're going where you're going. But then the mountain looms in the distance ominously, and Abraham realized, we're almost there. Again, we can find symbolism in the fact that he waited 3 days as opposed to 2 or 4. 3 days of sorrow symbolically matching what Mary and Peter and John and all the rest will endure between Good Friday and Easter Sunday. The journey gave Abraham precious time with Isaac. We can't underestimate the value of that time. The child, knowing nothing about what awaits, he probably enjoyed the trip. It was probably fun. If the servants noticed that Abraham was being unusually quiet or distant, Isaac probably didn't. Kids don't pick up on that kind of thing. Now that they have arrived, what will Abraham choose to do next? He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then we will come back to you." For several reasons, the servants needed to stay behind while Abraham and Isaac went on. That Abraham says, "We will come back," is really the only thing he could have said if he's going to tell them about what's coming next. But it's also a glimpse at the hope Abraham held on to, that the final outcome of this ordeal would not be the tragedy that it seems destined to be. He has hope that they will both come back somehow. Verse 6, Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife as the two of them went on together. Father and son both have a role to play in the upcoming sacrifice, once again speaking to us of the symbolic parallel of the role played in the crucifixion by our Heavenly Father and by the Son of God. If not for what Abraham knows is coming, this would have been a touching scene of a father passing down his religious belief to his son as they go to worship together. Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father." "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Now, we don't know Isaac's age, but he was at least old enough to understand what a burnt offering is, what one would need to perform it, and then to be able to look and see, hey, we're missing something, namely the animal to be sacrificed. Tells us that this was not the first time that Isaac had witnessed his father offering up a sacrifice to the Lord. So he naturally asks his dad, where are we going to find a lamb, right? He's a child, but he says, hey, we need a lamb, right, Dad? Don't we need one of those? That question would have punched Abraham right in the heart. Don't we need a lamb, Dad? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the two of them went on together. Abraham's reply sidesteps the question from the point of view that in his mind there will be no lamb, only Isaac. But Abraham's reply is also profoundly wise, even if he didn't know at the time how it would play out. He says, God will provide. Yahweh Yireh in Hebrew. Perhaps you know it with the Germanized J instead of the Y as Jehovah Jireh. Yireh is from the verb to see. Abraham is literally saying, God will see it. God will see to it. In other words, the lamb is God's business. It's up to him. This name is one that God's people throughout the centuries will appreciate. God is the one who will see to it. God is the one who gets things done, the one you can count on. Abraham had no idea how prophetic his words will turn out to be. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. This took time. You have to gather the stones, you have to arrange the stones, and then you have to place the wood on it so it will burn properly. No doubt Isaac helped gather some stones up for his dad. All the while, Abraham believes Isaac has an hour left to live. Isaac has 30 minutes, 10, 5. Very soon he will be required by his God to kill his beloved son. The emotional buildup is beyond words. He bound his son Isaac and placed him on the altar on top of the wood. Either Isaac was too young to physically resist, even though his old man was really old, or he chose not to, for reasons we can't guess at. The text of Genesis doesn't focus on Isaac. Abraham's actions are what matter here. And he continues to move ahead in obedience to do just what God told him to do. This is the interesting opposite perspective as in the gospel accounts. In the gospels, we see the other point of view. We see what Jesus is saying. We see what he is thinking, what he is going through as he approaches the cross. We even see what Jesus is thinking and feeling as he hangs on the cross. But the Father's viewpoint is not in focus for the gospel writers. Here we see Father and not Son. There it's the opposite. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. This is the moment of fulfillment. Abraham has taken every step to get to this point, and he doesn't hesitate to begin that very last step. Imagine what Abraham is feeling now. Imagine what Isaac is thinking. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. This whole episode began when God called and Abraham answered. At its climax, God calls again and Abraham responds again. God allowed it to go to the last dramatic moment, but he wasn't about to let it go any further. Here's what he says. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." As we know, God had no interest, never had any interest in human sacrifice. Such a notion is the antithesis of who God is. He is our creator. This was a real test, but it was never going to be anything more than a test. You might ask yourself, didn't God know Abraham already? Didn't he know his mind? Wouldn't he be able to tell the quality of his faith without needing to test it? Well, yes, but knowing and doing are not the same thing. Also, while God knew what Abraham would do, you know who didn't know what Abraham would do? Abraham. He didn't know the strength of his own faith until the moment he raised the knife and passed the test. The relationship between the Lord and Abraham began with God promising him tremendous blessings if he would be willing to leave his homeland and journey to a new land that God was promising his descendants. Now, at the time, Abraham and Sarah had no children, so God promised them that blessing too. Abraham believed God and obeyed. The years that followed required that he continued to live by faith while awaiting this promised child. And that was an emotionally difficult task, to be sure. But Abraham, up until this point, had never been asked by God to sacrifice anything of real value to him. One could argue Abraham followed God because God was exclusively good to him. Why wouldn't you? Look at all the things that he's doing for you. Who wouldn't want to stick with a God who continues to bless you like this? What if following God becomes costly? What if obedience means real sacrifice instead? This line of thought may be familiar because it's the beginning of the book of Job, where Satan says to God, "Well, of course Job likes you. Look at how good his life is." There's actually tremendous parallels between Job and Abraham here. It's the same theme. Because Job refused to accept only good things from God. When tragedy happened, Job says, I have to accept that too. The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord, he responded in his tragedy. Likewise, here we see Abraham being willing to lose that which he loves most if God requires it of him. So what's the application in our setting? It's a very powerful one, a very good one for us to keep at the forefront of our discipleship in our hearts and minds. To use a line that I've borrowed from before, I didn't make this up, what you win them with is what you win them to. If the gospel is presented to people as something that exclusively helps you without requiring any sacrifice in return, if all it is the blessings and nothing of the sacrifice, people who believe that sunny sales pitch will rebel against the reality of what it takes to live by faith. Our salvation is certainly 100% by grace through faith. We cannot do a thing to contribute to it. But our discipleship, once we are saved, demands that we become servants, willing to put others first. We're not going to have wealth and power and fame in this life simply because we follow Jesus. The prosperity gospel charlatans are lying to millions of people who buy into their deficient proclamation of the gospel, to the way that they're perverting it into a story about what I can get. It's about me and my needs. No. What God has promised us is that we will have, if we truly follow Jesus, an opportunity to serve the kingdom of God. And that service will indeed potentially involve persecution and sufferings, but at the very least, it will involve self-sacrifice. It will involve giving of ourselves for others. Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. In Abraham's case, the emotional and physical cost of being prepared to lose Isaac was sufficient. God had zero desire to take the boy's life, so God provided an alternate sacrifice, a substitute to take Isaac's place. To Abraham, this moment was relief beyond measure. It meant that his ordeal had ended. He would not need to trust that God would raise Isaac from the dead. He didn't have to go through that. For us, we see another powerful parallel to the work of Jesus Christ upon the cross, because we would have died for our own sins, justifiably so. But God provides a substitute to take our place. For Abraham, the ram's life didn't cost him much. It was an animal that God had provided. But for Jesus, being the substitute cost him pain, humiliation, anguish, and death, plus the fullness of the wrath of God at sin poured out upon him while he hung on that cross. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord, it will be provided. When Abraham told Isaac, God himself will provide the lamb, he was speaking as a prophet, although he didn't know it. God did indeed provide the means of rescue for Isaac. This is what God does. His righteous and holy nature requires that rebellion and sin be punished. It cannot simply be ignored, but his compassion, his mercy, and his love compel God to act, to provide a way for fallen humanity to be redeemed. That's God's choice, God's will, and God's purpose. It is only his own nature that requires it of him, because no one can force God to do anything. But the God who created mankind in his image would not watch us destroy ourselves without providing a life-saving alternative. The story also reminds us of the absolute truth that it is God and God alone who will provide our salvation. We can't do it on our own. We have not the power nor the will to do it. It must come from God, and it must be provided as an act of grace. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son. God has made numerous promises to Abraham in the decades of their relationship, which are recorded in Genesis. We've seen this several times. In each earlier episode, God simply promised, I'm going to do this thing. No further flourish on the oath was provided. Here, however, God swears to Abraham by himself, meaning that God invoked the highest possible authority, his own person. Now, we know that when God says a thing, God will do that thing. We don't hesitate to put our trust in the Word of God. One of the reasons why is because we have the testimony of God's faithfulness through all of these generations that are recorded in Scripture. Abraham was learning about God through Abraham's own experiences, so God chose to reward that faith that Abraham had just demonstrated how deep it really was by elevating his promise to him. It wasn't strictly necessary that he do this. Rather, it was part of building up the relationship between God and Abraham. God said, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me. Now, much of that is familiar, but there are two new elements that emerge in this restating of God's promise to Abraham. Number one, the mention of conquering cities from their enemies is the very first time in Genesis that we learn that when God gives Abraham's descendants the promised land, they're going to take possession of it by conquest. Of course, we will see the fulfillment of that under the leadership of Joshua after the Exodus. The second thing that is new here is that also this is the first time that God's covenant promises to Abraham have been connected in any way to obedience. Previously, God simply made promises. I will bless you. This is an act of grace. That's still the foundation, of course, for it all began when God chose Abraham. But now we see that Abraham's obedience plays a role in enhancing what God had already promised. We see in this story the need we have to speak first and foremost of God's wondrous grace as it was given to Abraham and Israel and the Gentiles, and eventually, of course, to you and I, and to speak of the subsequent necessary response to that grace of obedience by the people of God. Without God's power, we cannot. Without the obedience of God's people embracing that power by faith and putting it into action, God will not. There's a partnership envisioned here in God's plan. And then lastly, Abraham returned to his servants, and they set off together for Beersheba, and Abraham stayed in Beersheba. The story concludes with the simple return trip home. Now that Abraham has passed the test of faith, and we saw every step of the way, not much to tell about the trip home. They just went home. So what do we take from this very familiar text? Three things that I hope you learn from and remember from this. Number one, God chose to test Abraham's faith. As our creator, our sustainer, our redeemer, our judge, God has every right to challenge us to obey him more fully. Number two, Genesis focuses not on Abraham's inner turmoil, but on his outward steps of obedience. Now, the former matters to God. Don't ever believe that God doesn't care about our emotional health. But ultimately, it is the latter that is necessary. In the end, we need to find our way to obedience. Thirdly, and lastly, The offering of Isaac that was interrupted by a substitute has become powerfully symbolic to Christians as a foreshadowing of the plan of the Father and the obedience of the Son that led to Jesus' death on the cross.